Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. And in this video, we're going to be checking out Fads as he takes on the topic of why people don't want to have kids anymore. He puts out a video called "It's Not Just You, No One Wants Kids Anymore." And naturally, that kind of title is going to pique my interest. We've covered certain concepts of parenting in the past, so I figured that was in lieu of some of the stuff we've covered on the channel. If you're not familiar with my content, stay tuned to the end to hear my full thoughts. So without further ado, let's get into it. It's not just you. No one wants kids anymore.
The US fertility rate drops to another historic low. Births in Japan hit record low. Italy's national birth rate is declared a national emergency. Nearly every country is due to shrink by 2100. There's little to no doubt that there's an ongoing fertility crisis. People are choosing to not have babies anymore. From South Korea to the United States to Norway to Taiwan, pretty much every rich country. And you might not think this is a problem, but it is a problem for a few reasons. The reality is that people are living longer than ever at the moment. When people start to live this long, you need new workers to replace the ones that are retiring. You need new workers to pay taxes that will eventually fund the pensions of those who retire.
Healthier societies.
And you need young people in the workforce to take care of those older people. In the 1960s, there were 6 people of working age for every retired person. And by 2035, it's expected to be 2 to 1. This is one of those topics where if you ask 5 different people, you'll get 5 completely different answers as to what the reason is. People tend to have quite strong opinions. Some people might say it's a cost of living issue. Some people might say that it's to do with declining rates of religion in the world. Some people might blame women's liberation movements, for example. Either way, no matter what people say, they're typically pretty certain that either their experience or their belief is the reason why, on a global scale, people aren't having children.
There's something there that's not being measured because it's hard to measure, but it's kind of it's part of my theory as to what's going on. Stay tuned.
I think we can do better than that, because when I see that there's a problem that is affecting Norway, the US, Taiwan, and France, I tell myself that there's got to be a better answer that we can give, right? Because these countries are completely different. The childcare situation, for example,
But there's a common theme.
Norway is vastly different to the childcare situation in the US, which is vastly different to the UK. So I feel like we can get a better answer than just this one-line solution of, oh, it's the cost of living. I think we can do better. If you'd asked me, to be honest, even just a couple of weeks ago, I would have put the blame squarely on the cost of housing. In fact, there's this one chart that lives in my head rent-free.
It's very interesting because a lot of people do not remember the 90s all that well, especially the people that are more predominant on the platform. But the people that do remember the 90s remember a time where the price of things was so astronomically low. And it's crazy to see how much that went rampant, but the aspects of employment didn't meet that growth. And I think that's
a chart that compares the growth of house prices
very rough
to the growth of incomes in the UK. And intuitively, to me, it feels like that's why people wouldn't want to have kids. And to a lot of people, it feels that way. But I want to challenge my intuition, and maybe we can reach a more nuanced answer as to why this is more of a global problem than necessarily a specific localized problem. For example, this is a piece of research from the US, which tried to establish what the effect of a $10,000 increase in housing would be on people's decision to have kids. Unsurprisingly, if house prices go up, it corresponds to a 2.4% drop in the decision to have kids if you are renting. However, if you own your home, you actually become more likely to have kids as house prices go up. The net effect of this is that when house prices go up in the US, more people actually want to have kids, which is really counterintuitive. But there is some variance because
But notice how low of a change occurs though. And I think that's why this kind of piece of information is, sure, you can use more and less, but is it enough to make a difference in the wide scheme of things?
UK, the effect of increasing house prices is a net decrease. And this is just one piece of evidence that immediately helps us understand that we can't just think of this problem as a one-line solution. Clearly, housing can't explain the full picture. I think the cost of having children is another huge factor that people typically fall back on when they explain the reasons why people aren't having kids. It's too expensive. However, it seems that even paying people to have kids isn't working very well. Taiwan spent more than $3 billion trying to get its citizens to have more children, and it's had no success at all. In France, they've spent even more money, about 4% of their GDP, on various measures to encourage people to have children. To put this into perspective, if the US spent 4% of its GDP on family measures, that would be the equivalent of the entire defense budget. So some countries at least, are actually spending a huge amount of money on things like tax breaks, things like direct cash transfers, and things like childcare benefits to encourage people to have kids. So clearly there's a bit more to this whole situation than meets the eye initially. And I think we can maybe look at some of the research and evidence, because there is a whole body of research and evidence to engage with. And I've tried to find the best bits to share it with you. And I'm curious to hear what your opinions are on these different aspects. What I do find really interesting is like how the narrative has changed around this topic, because a couple of decades ago, overpopulation was all the rage. All of the discussion around the number of people on Earth revolved around the fact that there were too many people. And we have two people to blame for this. First of all, we have this dude here. His name is Thomas Malthus, and he is an 18th century economist. And he was the first major figure to really write about this idea of a population boom. He saw that the quality of life in 18th century England was dropping pretty quickly, and he said that there was just too many people and that we'd get to a point where there wouldn't be enough food to sustain the growing population. And a couple of decades later, another professor wrote about the same topic. His name was Paul Ehrlich, and he wrote a book called The Population Bomb. And people really believed them. To kind of put into perspective how scared people were of overpopulation, I want to share a quote by the chairman of the Federal Reserve in the US, who said that overpopulation could be more explosive than the atomic or hydrogen bomb. Even on the other side of the world, in China, these fears of overpopulation promote.
He's about to cover it, but the one-child policy out of China was it was unjustified government control based on a theory. And I don't think that control should ever be based on a theory. And I think there's often a lot of situations where you need to do a little more groundwork than that to implement a wide range of biological control on people that is government sanctioned in order to make a decision like this. It's
China's decision to implement their one-child policy, the whole package of laws and regulations.
Because they're wrong as hell. They were completely wrong. And now it's the reverse because they decided to make a decision based on a theory.
Designed to stop Chinese people from having more than one child. If we fast forward to today, those fears were like clearly unfounded. I think.
But I'm tripping by that picture. I was confused.
Most of us understand that food insecurity is a distribution problem and not an agriculture problem. And instead, we've ended up in the situation where underpopulation is the problem, where there are not enough young people. And I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the US specifically, because I think they've got some really interesting factors that paint a different picture of the fertility crisis to the one that you might have in your head at the moment. This is a graph of the US fertility rates, and it's the kind of graph that makes you want to jump to.
I'm going to take a wild guess and say the assumption that he thinks we're all going to jump to is the 1960s. What happened then? Birth control. But it wasn't the only thing that happened. The solidarity of motherhood also happened. It's quite a crash.
A specific conclusion or a one-line answer as to what's going on here. But the real interesting part of this graph isn't what it looks like now. It's what it looks like when you kind of break it down by demographics. And thankfully, The Economist has done this for me. If we look at birth rate divided by age, we see some really interesting trends. Somewhat surprisingly, the fertility rate amongst women over 30 has actually been steadily rising since the 1990s. However, you might see something else that's quite interesting. Birth rates amongst 15 to 19-year-old women in the US dropped dramatically. The actual figure is 77%. And they actually explain that more than half of the drop in America's total fertility rate is driven by women under 19 choosing to no longer have kids. Around a third of these births would have been unplanned, and the majority of these births would have been on low incomes as well. In the UK, we actually see a similar trend where women at age 20 are having half as many children. Unlike richer women, these young women are not going to compensate by having more kids in the future. And I actually want to take a brief second.
Well, that actually kind of makes sense because I think that a lot of women in their 30s are coming to the realization that they actually did want kids, because you got to also imagine that women in their 30s back in the 90s and even now were all pitched the same spill about feminism at the time, which is you don't need kids, you don't need a family, you don't need anything. and they believed it through their 20s. And then when they got done with their senses of career, whatever they decided to pursue, academics, whatever, they still, I feel like they still arrive to the same concept of, no, I still kind of want kids. And I think that that's often a fulfilling answer that a lot of women eventually arrive to. It's just a matter of finding partners that allow for that perspective to exist. And I think the reason why 15 to 19 year olds in today's era, the reason why that's not happening is because interpersonal relationships are so rare nowadays. And that's why they considered that majority of the births that would have happened would have been unplanned, because there's just a lot of recklessness and poor self-regulation that's going on amongst kids right now. And it's even worse than before, because naturally kids in their teens already have a predisposition to have poor self-regulation. Got it. That's marked in the books. However, what's made that worse is that we don't have the same morally developed families that we used to. And that was kind of a little bit of a counterbalance. It meant that teens were still going to be poorly self-regulated. Yeah, sure. But we had more wholesome families or holistic families to at least counterbalance a lot of it. And now that we have less of that, there's no counterbalance anymore. And now it's just a degradation of the concept. And I think explains both.
And to have a little aside and talk about the fact that often the most vilified group of people are actually the most important group of people to society. I'm sure you've heard young single mothers described as a burden on society or as lazy. But clearly these women were actually like the backbone of the economy. It's an aspect that I feel many people don't actually think about. Obviously,
that's a bit of a long shot. We just paused and talked about something else, but this is a bit of a long shot. You can't say that single mothers are the backbone of society or the economy for that matter, because you're implying that every child brought up by a single mother is now contributing to society in some economic fashion, when that's not. The thing is that more often than not, kids, especially nowadays, kids are born in single mother households. Correct. That doesn't change that they are less likely to altruistically benefit society or contribute to society in some form. They're actually more likely to not do so. They're less likely to graduate. They're more likely to go to prison. They're less likely to succeed whenever fathers are not in the home. So the fact that it just happens more often, I feel like is just an abundant statistic that happens. Because it happens more often, there's a bigger sample size to pull from. And then we pull from the successes that happen from single mothers, even though it's rare that it happens, but we still pull that in comparison to the success of children that happens in full families or autonomic families. It's a bit of a niche conversation. And I guess that'd be an interesting statistic to pull, is children that succeed from wholesome families as a number count versus children that succeed from single mother households as a number count. And then comparing that to see, okay, who succeeds more often. And obviously it leads to a competitive comparison naturally, but it's not to poop on everybody, on anyone's upbringing or anything like that. It's just, he's bringing up a point and that's his perspective on the point. But I don't think laziness or vilifying single mothers was the problem. I think it was the biological tendencies that come with parenting that single mothers aren't able to reach by themselves, and how important a father is in that home should he be there. I think that's really what it is, because when you have a single mother in a household, she can't do it all. She can hit the check boxes, but she's always going to have a hard time being the authority figure and being the person that teaches the child how to be, not how to act. Because teaching a child how to act is often very simple, but the why and how to be and setting that proper example and living by an example is often much more harder on women by themselves, because women express themselves more, which means that when stress comes, it also is released more. And I think that kind of gets in the way. And it's not the fact that they're lazy or they're lazy on average or whatever. That wasn't the case. It's just the demands of parenting, I guess.
It would be unreasonable to say that the reason that no one is having kids is purely because teen pregnancies are down. The economic aspect of it is clearly important. It's clearly relevant. I don't think it's a coincidence, if you look in this graph, that the countries that have the lowest fertility rate in Europe, countries like Italy, Spain, and Greece, are also the countries with the highest youth unemployment, the countries where young people live with their parents for the longest, and the economy is in the bin, basically. And if you just ask young adults why they're not having kids, a lot of them will say that it's simply because childcare is too expensive. What I do find interesting, though, is that the fertility crisis is one that affects the whole world. And it affects countries that spend an incredible amount of money on social programs for kids. So this is a quote by Robert Reich. If you don't know who Robert Reich is, he was US Secretary of Labor. He says that Norway spends around $30,000 per child on early childhood care. Finland spends $23,000. Germany spends $18,000. And the US spends $500 per child. Obviously, the US has a huge childcare spending problem. It just doesn't want to invest in young children. But Norway, which is spending incredible amounts on early childhood care, is still seeing a below replacement birth rate. And when we talk about this problem, we tend to lump men and women in together as if their experience of having children is identical, when there are actually some pretty significant differences that can at least help us explain some more of the trend towards choosing to not have children. And one of these big factors is the fact that women's earnings drop significantly after having a child, and that drop persists.
So this is kind of stuff that I'm talking about. I think that so I see the variable first childbirth. I don't see the variable if this is strictly men by themselves with kids and strictly women by themselves with kids, like the single parent household concept, single mother or single father. Now, obviously you can hit me in the comment section, but doesn't this make sense? I don't find this to be regular, and I think that this makes sense, especially with the condition that I said earlier about how women express the stress more because of the burden that parenting can bring to your life. I think that often when men have kids, if anything, they're more likely to find a sense of purpose and drive and determination to do what needs to be done because they understand that these eyes are on them, and the concept of ego is very prominent in men. However, with women, they're more likely to be expressive with the stress felt. And so it's going to do what? It's going to bleed into other areas of their life. And that's not necessarily a weakness. It's just that's what's going to happen biologically because women aren't equipped for the same concepts of stress or the same control mechanisms of stress because women often feel more or are less tolerant to the same stressors that exist. And that's not necessarily the issue. The issue is that we need to understand that this is a problem, and children outside of relationships or in poor standing of relationships is just a terrible idea, which would bring us back to the concept of, the majority of childbirths are from out of wedlock relationships. And that's not really a religious pitch. It's just working on interpersonal relationships before these kind of things happen. Because otherwise you're going to have a child with someone that you don't see long term because you only saw them as a sense of enjoyment and not an actual partner. And that happens on the men's side too, right?
Decades after they have children. This is not so much of a problem for men. Men who choose to have kids don't earn significantly less than men who don't choose to have kids. Mm-hmm. And they don't also experience a short-term drop in the amount that they earn. Correct. Gender-based differences in terms of the experience of childcare, I think are a remarkably important factor because ultimately, you need two people to have a child. This tracks with the work of Dr. Matthias Dupke. He's like the guy to talk about family economics. It's his area of specialty. He talks at length about the differences between low fertility countries and ultra low fertility countries. In the countries that have the lowest levels of fertility,
the burden of childcare is higher, with women doing up to 80% of parental duties. Well, isn't single mother households close to high 60s, low 70s in regards to the percentage? So I guess that. And then the other 30% would be dual parent households, in which case the household is more likely to be traditional. So it makes sense to me.
There is a clear trend of women taking on a greater percentage of the burden of childcare. So in the really low fertility countries, the percentage of childcare duties that is taken on by women can be as high as 80%. In countries that have slightly better fertility ratios, this percentage is much closer to 50-50. There's still a huge stigma in some of these countries, particularly South Korea and Japan, where women are still expected to spend huge amounts of time at home taking care of children, but they can't survive without having a career, or they simply just want a career, which is also.
I mean, I guess I was wrong, but I guess I assumed a lot of these countries to be a little more traditional in reference to the family. The idea that when they have children, they're not taken care of by the husband is kind of my own ignorance, I guess.
Very reasonable. The decision to have kids is, in some extent, a signal of optimism, right? A signal in the belief that you'll have a good future, your kid will have a good future, and the world on the whole has a good future ahead of it. And I think these disparate factors all play into a single idea of optimism about the world. There's a really good research group called Our World in Data. They're amazing. They compiled some data on how optimistic people feel about the world. And you can see that there's this concentration of rich, low fertility countries at the bottom of this graph. And I think it helps us at least explain somewhat why the countries that are even trialing just direct one-off cash payments are not seeing remarkable improvement. Giving someone a one-off payment doesn't necessarily make them feel like the world is going to be a better place in the next 5, 10, 15 years. On the other hand, places like Taiwan have tried extended maternity leave, and that hasn't worked because that has actually increased the risk for women. They're going to be out of the workforce for longer, and they're going to struggle to recover the income that they once had. There are these macro factors like the gender wage gap, which are kind of creating like a negative pressure, and it's not enough to balance that negative pressure. But importantly, it's also worth mentioning that a lot of the drop in fertility is actually...
I don't know if this is going to upset people, but in the United States, there is no gender wage gap. Now, I think the last piece of information was covered by UN, and I think it was in a place like Nigeria. United States does not have a gender wage gap. What we're seeing, I think, is output, effort, and possible stigma. I think that the variable or condition of women handling stress a little less efficiently in the workplace is contributing to their efforts in the workplace. That's not all women. By no means is that all women. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying on average. And you may have, some workhorse women out there, not in reference to the animal at all, but just some go-getters out there that do exist. And I think that they're the exception to the rule, but they do not break the rule. And I think that that's what we really need to think about when we see how men succeed and how women succeed in similar fields. If we look at engineering or law or things of that sort, we're going to see men outpacing women on average by a long shot, because women often fall off, do less, quit, move on, start families instead. And there's nothing wrong with that. But the point is that it's not because they both started with equivalent criteria and conditions and they were started off with different pay. No. And I think that a lot of times where you do see that, or you did see a difference, it's probably because one of them argued a better income, right? Maybe he was like, okay, well, because I have this, and they were willing to fight for a wage increase upon being hired. And I think that that's a pitch in interviews that a lot of people don't try because, they'd rather be more agreeable than disagreeable. And I think that that's another biological component, is women are often more agreeable while men are often more disagreeable. And that's another thing to think about whenever you think about an interview and putting in your 2 cents in reference to what you think you deserve at that job.
A good thing. It represents that people have agency. People can actually choose whether or not to have children, especially women. In fact, we use the term fertility crisis when it's not really a fertility crisis. It's a worker crisis. Governments aren't trying to create self-actualized, happy, positive individuals. They're trying to create meat for the grinder.
So that was Fad's video on It's Not Just You. Nobody wants kids anymore. And I'm starting to see a theme with his videos in general. I'm pretty sure it was actually a live stream, so good on him to be able to get those points out accurately and efficiently and then editing it into a YouTube video. Now, when it comes down to my points, I might lose a few people because my perspective involves 3 variables. Now, the way I see it is the concept of children, or people becoming parents or wanting to have children, is affected and influenced by economy, character, and technology. Now, we can all admit to various forms of economic crisis. Inflation, housing, taxes, what have you. No one's arguing that. And everyone can say that it's a pretty fair argument if you use that as your reason of, no, I can't do this because of economics. By all means. The subjective information that comes from character and technology is rather significant. And I think that holds true when you're trying to understand why people don't have kids anymore. Even though you had several countries experiencing similar things, I think the common thing that we're seeing is technology and how that can intervene in reference to what we should achieve or what we should pursue. And I think that technology, especially things like social media and apps and dating apps for that matter, has really put a hamper on what we can achieve interpersonally. And if we don't ever go out and holistically achieve these things, how likely is it that we're ever going to find someone significant enough to face the challenge of parenting with? It's not going to happen. And then another concept of character. Whether we want to admit it or not, a lot of the reasons that people don't have kids is because of inadequacy. They fear the concept of parenting. Now, whether they feel insufficient, inadequate, or they don't trust themselves with the decision of finding someone that can establish that trust and confidence in them to do so. I think that there's often the case of women being in relationships with men who, bring a sense of comfort and content to their lives, but not enough power to their life to where seeing children with this person is a good idea. Now, that may take a shot at many people's relationships. And I mean, I'll beg to differ in reference to whoever wants to debate that concept of, we need to understand that if we're with someone and we're making a conscious decision to not have children, we're going against a biological tendency that we have because of norms that we've created because of the person that we're with. And if we're doing that, that's also because we don't see them as long-term, or we don't see them as someone that can do that or is good for that. And we may not even assess it in that way until it comes down to, I kind of been thinking about kids. I had this experience with this child, and it brought a lot of good feeling in reference to what I was capable of. And I think that can get in the way. And it's the same reference. It's the same thing with men as well. With men who are with a woman at the time who's fun and rambunctious or whatever, it's a fun relationship, right? There's a lot of excitement and emotion chasing in the relationship, but that doesn't always lead to fulfillment in a sense of a family bond. And often it's going to lead to something far more chaotic, because although it was fun, it was never serious. And I think that can kind of get in the way too. So a lot of men will check out early in reference to the relationships they might find themselves in, because they're going to have fun with the girl, but not take her serious enough to say that this girl is going to have my children. And I don't think that men ever make the decision, or on average, make the decision that, oh, this fun girl means she's going to be a good mom. We need to understand that parenting is only something we should pursue after development of ourselves. And in the process of finding us, do we concrete who we are to impart wisdom on another? And I don't think that we can ever achieve a good sense of parental behavior if we don't achieve that. And I think that that's why we have the iPad children. We have parental skills based on technology now. And obviously those are the two variables and conditions that impede and manipulate things down a negative dimension. And it blows my mind that we're not thinking of it as this serious life-changing decision. And the one argument that a lot of people have is like, well, we'll figure it out. It's like, no, you needed to know who you were before this happened. Otherwise, you're going to be figuring it out while the child is born. And all you're going to have is a lot of hypocrisy in the upbringing of that child, because as you start to find yourself through parenting, you need to understand that children are observant, and they're much more observant than you think, and they're much more observant at a sooner age than you think. And children can recall things all the way back to when they're 3 years old, 4 years old. And if you think that you can get away with being aloof and undisciplined and poor and having poor character or conduct all the way up until they're 8, and then you try to take it seriously, it's too late. They may not even tell you. And this is why a lot of kids are seeking therapy in teens and early adulthood. It's because they had the parent that was trying to figure it out during their whole upbringing. And I'll tell you right now that the ages of 4 to 10 in reference to kids is the most important time of their lives. This is the socialization process of their upbringing. This is where the base and foundation of who they're going to be exists. And if we spend that 4 to 10 of their life figuring ourselves out, then we never impart something important enough for them to move forward. And that's obviously something that's going to have a lot of contention. I'm probably going to get a lot of kickback for these kind of beliefs and concepts, but we need to understand that there's more to it than just, oh, it's because I'm not rich enough yet. And it's like a lot of the cases in reference to the United States, especially, there's a lot of programs and systems in place to help people who have children, especially if they're by themselves. So although, as his graph states, that we only spend $500 per child, there's a lot more going into welfare and child assistance programs that don't apply to that $500, it seems. But that's not necessarily something I'm too knowledgeable about, so I'm not going to really dive into that in its entirety. There's a lot that I can learn, especially surrounding economics, as an example. But the one thing that I have been able to experience a lot of is the detriments of technology and the absence of characterological development. And so naturally, these are the things that I'm going to take a closer look at and see, or at least explain why this has to do with that. And I do plan to cover parenting as a concept in the future. Hopefully I have those watching that will be looking forward to such a concept. So with that being said, thank you to everyone for watching. If you liked the video, like it. If you enjoyed the content so far, consider subscribing. If you disliked the video, then dislike it. Hopefully you'll never see me again. I understand that I may have triggered some people, but the one thing that I'll always be is transparent. And my consistency will always be to challenge people's way of thinking. Even if you want to reverse Uno card back at me, challenge my way of thinking. By all means, hit a comment in the comment section down below for your thoughts and perspectives. Why people are having less children nowadays, why we have less parents, maybe why we even have less role models. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. So thanks again, and I'll go ahead, see you next time.